Values are literally the foundation of how we start building up a stronger, more aligned core of what we live by.
Any successful relationship starts with finding your center, the truth at the core of who you are. Only then can you develop the ability to truly connect with someone else. Concentric is about aligning with people who share a common center. This show gives you the tools and the skills to do just that through practical training, real-life stories and examples, and in-depth interviews with people who have taken this journey and come out the other side better for it. Welcome to Concentric. We're glad you're here. Welcome to episode 5 of Concentric. Today starts our 3-part series on values. We wanted to get into these early on because discovering your values and really identifying those top 5 specifically, it's foundational to everything you're going to do in life, certainly in relationships, certainly in how you interact with really anyone in life, but even yourself. And when you find those uncomfortable moments in life, or when you feel that overwhelm and frustration, especially with yourself, a lot of times you're living outside of those values or counter to what you truly value in life. And if you haven't taken that time to identify what those are, how are you ever going to win? How are you going to get past those, right? I did this process for the first time several years ago with Gary. A very uncomfortable process in how he goes through. I joke about that because it's tough. It's asking a lot of the hard questions, but it's phenomenal on the other side and going through that. And there's so many aha moments going through it, and it's so worthwhile. So in this first episode of the series, we dig into really why it's critical that you figure this out, and some of that process, and why specifically your top 5 values and what that means. And then in episode 6, we get into me going through that process and really getting a picture for you to see, okay, how can I whittle these down? Here's all the options that I could have, right? But how do I identify mine and really pit the values against each other, essentially, to see which ones come out on top and are really core to you at this stage in your life. And then in episode 7, we get into, great, I've identified these. Now what? What's life like now? How do I use these insights to move forward and to improve my relationships? All right, let's jump in. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to Concentric. I'm Jason Croft. I'm here with the great Gary Day Rodriguez.
It's so good to see you, Jason. I was just saying to you before we started, I'm like, I look so forward to our time together that we can just hook up and have conversations. So I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. Me too. This is so much fun. Digging through just fascinating topics, one after the other. And sometimes, these topics and what we want to come up with just come out of the blue, come out of during the week, something that's, on my mind or things. But I was really purposeful with, honestly, these next 3 episodes that we're going to do all around values. This is such a foundational topic to everything you teach, everything that we need as we move through this world, that we really couldn't go much further with this show without digging into this topic. So I really want the listeners and viewers out there, this episode is all going to be around, what are we even talking about when we say values? And then what does that mean? Why are they important? And in the next episode, really walk through an example of how do you dig through and really identify what yours are. Third one going, great, I have this list of values. What next? What do I do with these? And so, Gary, walk us through what you even mean when you tell people, hey, you need to identify your values.
I before we go there,
Mhm.
I feel really compelled to talk about why, like why these are so important to us,
Mhm.
why living a value-driven life is so vital. And in our conversation right before we started to record, um, we were talking about what happens to people in relationships. And as we spoke, this great, I think, thing came out of either your mouth or my mouth, which happens quite spontaneously. Who the heck knows how it comes out? But it's it's how we will be in a relationship with another person. And what oftentimes happens, not always, but what oftentimes happens is that rather than stay in a strengthened sense of ourselves, in a very well defined, powerful place of this is who I absolutely am, we start to see ourselves through the lens and the eyes of another. And
Mhm.
if it's loving, that's empowering and supportive. If it's critical, then it starts to take away pieces of ourselves that we start to spend a lot of our energy attempting to become what our partners so desire us to be, or what our bosses desire us to be, and to perform, to behave in such a way that we get approval from others. And it's very subtle, it doesn't happen all at once. It happens incrementally until a person will land in a place in their life and say, where did I go? Like, what happened to those pieces of
Well,
me?
not only is it subtle and small, but sometimes it's completely made up, right? We're guessing that
Yeah,
that's what they want, or what they haven't even expressed it. They may be completely fine with how we operate through this world.
yeah.
Um, and it may be something else entirely.
It could easily be. I mean, how many times have we hallucinated that there's a problem when there actually was never a problem? And this is, of course, eventually we'll get to the critical conversation piece. But this is where, when couples do not have critical conversations, this we have to give meaning. We are meaning making creatures. So if we're reading the nonverbals and hallucinating what those nonverbals mean, we may or may not be accurate. And as a consequence, we will interpret things based upon, generally, not always, our deepest fears.
Yeah.
So the reason values become so important is because values are literally the foundation of how we start building up a stronger, more aligned core of what we live by. So the top five values always drive behavior. And values, if we were going to define them through Webster, they are incredibly critical and important beliefs. So beliefs are that a core event occurs in our lives. This could be at our birth, but then we develop a constellation of beliefs because we're meaning making creatures. And as the core events occur and they bombard our five senses, we're trying to make meaning out of it, which turns then eventually into this constellation of beliefs that we develop. Now, what's really curious for us, and how this fabulous vehicle we're riding around in called a human body, we have a reticular activating system at the base of our skull. It's about this the width of a pencil and about that long. And what it does is it sort of eliminates from our awareness contrary and opposing beliefs and perspectives to our own already established beliefs, that oftentimes we don't even see the alternatives. And this is how people become more and more and more contracted into a belief system. It's almost like we have an inbuilt Facebook algorithm sorter that that sorts for, okay, well, you're searching on that, let's give you more evidence that that's true. And so when you do a search on like Wayfair or Facebook, they will feed you more of what you're searching for, so that it keeps your interest engaged. We're very much the same, a little
Mhm.
different, but very much the same. So what our values do is they return us back to who we actually really are. Our values are deeply unconscious. a lot of people say, well, I know what my values are, but if we take 20 of our values, you can take a list of 100, distill those values down to 20, and then begin to start whittling down and doing contrastive analysis on what values are actually the most important. And it's really important that we look at what the word that you think is so important, that represents the value you think is so important, what that actually means. I know I was doing a contrastive analysis with a client the other day, and it was love. And love was coming out as the top of their top 5 values. And then I contrasted it against determination. And they were like, wow. And then they started to think about it differently. And they said, I asked them, do you have to be determined to stay in love? They were like, yes, I absolutely have to stay determined. And then we contrasted love against courage. And they said, well, if I think about it that way, I actually have to be courageous to stay in a long-term relationship and learn to work through my judgments, my fears, my anger, my disappointments. And I have to have the courage to face myself in order to stay in love.
Yeah, to even experience love on the other end.
So you experience love on the other end instead of projection and codependency. And when we got done, love was still in their top 5, but it had dropped down to number 5 because there were all of these other internal qualities that had to be present and actualized in order for them to stay in a long-term loving relationship.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. If you want to take a deep dive into the concepts Gary is talking about here and so much more, I've got something for you. From time to time on the show, you may hear us talk about Gary's course, Creating Incredible Relationships. This course is the culmination of Gary's 35 years worth of seminars, one-on-one training, and transforming the lives of over 11,000 people on 4 different continents. To learn how to build alignment and heck, just get along with others sometimes, we all require skills that are not commonly known and are not out there in the relationship development space. We need help. That's why Gary put this course together. The content in it is powerful and comprehensive. But just like we've done with this show, it's put together in a way that's easily consumable and quickly implemented. To gain the ability to take every relationship you have or want to have to the next level, go to garyscourse.com and see how to get started. Now, back to the show.
And so we sat back after we got done, and I said, did you think that your top 5 values would be the ones that you've chosen? And they were like, absolutely not. I thought it would be financial freedom. I thought it would be my children. I thought it would be my marriage. I thought it would be all of those things. But what I realized is that none of those things I could ever achieve if I didn't have these internal qualities. So this is why I always say that the relationship journey is actually the journey of self-awareness and self-leadership. Because if you cannot wake yourself up to one of to the highest expression of what you know that you're capable of and live it as consistently as you possibly can, then having a long-term loving relationship, that is not going to be your salvation. What's going to be your salvation is the relationship with self. And then that self, that character that you are evolving to be, that's where someone comes along with like and similar energy. And that's when you can come together as 2 whole people and share dynamic, powerful, creative aspects of how you want to live your life together.
That's great.
So this becomes a bit of a different focus. So going back to values truly are, when we lead a value-driven life, it gives us a center, it gives us an anchor, it gives us a core. So the very first way that we could begin to start looking at the values is much like what I asked you to do for our show today. was to take, a number of values. Maybe you started off with 50 or 100 values and look at them and really analyze which one out of those 50 or 100 values, what are the 20 values that are the most important to you? And what we're going to do so that everybody can kind of model this and follow this along, because one of our outcomes that we agreed to before we ever decided to start the show is that we want to give tools to people. We want them to be able to listen and get something of deep value. So then the next episode, we're going to start going into how to actually take this 20 and then distill it down into something that is going to be pretty accurate to what your top 5 are. And you're going to know when you land on it, whether you got them or not.
Yeah, and I'm excited to both go through that process again, but also share that with the audience here, and it's very eye opening. 2 thoughts around this. One is, what I want to make sure that we're hammering home too is that we all have these values, whether we're consciously aware of them or not. We're operating from some set of values of what's important to us and not, and then a lot of times where that discomfort or where we go off the rails is that we're not operating, we're not being true to those values to us. Sometimes laziness, life, whatever, but sometimes we haven't gone and consciously identified what those values are. So we don't even realize we're living out of alignment with those. And so how could we possibly, stay on track and get to where we want to get with our lives if we haven't identified those?
There's something, you just sparked something in me, because I did want to share this, but this is probably a perfect time to share it. Because I do so much, one-on-one coaching, that when I find someone who's deeply unhappy or has a huge propensity to anger, I always view that as someone who's very deeply misaligned to their own values. Mm-hmm. Someone who has low self-esteem, deeply misaligned to their own values. And what I have noticed is that once you become aligned to your top 5, because a lot of times people are betraying their top 5 values, but if you don't know what they are, then you're going to betray them. And when people betray their top 5 values, and they consistently do it over a period of time, it causes depression, because they are so misaligned to who they actually are that it becomes this constant seeking outside yourself for validation because you feel so weak internally inside yourself. So being in alignment with your top 5 values brings not only happiness, it starts to break apart that cycle of depression. It starts strengthening you from the inside out and growing your self-worth. And if there's anything that I've seen that causes the greatest suffering in relationships, is with people with low self-worth depending on the other person to validate them enough so they feel okay. And if 2 people are doing that, they'll be constantly failing each other because neither one of them have that strong sense of core. So it becomes this exercise in disappointment and lack, and an exercise in just feeling like a deep dissatisfaction. But it comes us because we're seeking outside, where the only well that's going to quench that thirst is inside.
Yeah. And before we wrap up this episode, what's the significance kind of around 5? Around the top 5, why not go through, like, I know my top 40 values, like, I'm gonna go through life with these. What's that significance?
Well, I'll tell you how I interpret that significance is that the mind can't focus on very much consistently. It can focus on anywhere from 2 to 5 to actualize it. When you're giving instructions to someone in a coaching format, you don't want to give them any more than 2 things to focus on to really actualize in their lives. Because when you give them a lot, it's just overwhelming and they do very little. If you give them very narrow boundaries and say, these 2 things is what you have to actualize in word, thought, and action. Nothing more. These two things, actualize those. And then it gives someone a win, something not too complex, and a win. Once they have the win, we never leave something unless we have something better to take its place. And if you don't set people up to win by making a focused effort on 1 to 2 things, they generally crash and burn, and they feel worse about themselves because they failed themselves yet again with this simple task. So I say no more than 5 values. Generally, when you distill them down to 5, they become very condensed and very focused, and they eliminate all the superfluous values, and they become really focused on those top 5. And you'll find that there are, I call them umbrella values. Generally, the top 5 values, each one of those values has multiple other values underneath them that are included or assumed that if I actualize this value, all these other values will be actualized along with them. So we're looking for the top 5 values that will undoubtedly have multiple values under the umbrella of them, because to have love, to be consistent in the art of love, you have to have courage. You have to have determination. Those were all kind of umbrella values underneath that of love.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other point to that is you can kind of, it's kind of 5 at a time. It's not like you're locking in these 5 and this is the rest of your life and you better adhere to these. This isn't that kind of aspect. No. This is something that we should revisit every few months, once a year. Like, is this still, because it's okay that they change. Life changes. And it's usually, especially if you're digging into this and operating this way, it's an evolution upwards, right? Like, oh, this is less important now because I got this handled. Now I really, in this phase or this season of my life, this is more important. So that's another aspect to that of it's almost 5 at a time.
Yeah, and thank you for actually bringing that up, because values do change. And what's important is that when we have incredible events that happen in our lives, our values will shift. If someone is valuing X, Y, and Z, and they have a health crisis, do you think health becomes a higher value? Absolutely. If someone is young and entrepreneurial and they're out there, they've already traveled the world, they're now sitting down to focus on their business, and bam, suddenly they meet someone with and they get pregnant. Do children become a higher value? Where children weren't even on the radar before. So these big significant events will happen in our lives, and our values do shift and change and reshuffle themselves in priority as a consequence of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been just such a great refresher too on the importance of these, and I love that we're sharing with the audience this really foundational aspect to getting things right with themselves, and then getting things right with those around them. So let's wrap up this episode here, and we'll dig in and we'll get into some of this messy work in the next episode.
Okay, and it's going to be your messy work, which will be good.
I know. All right, see y'all next time.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Concentric. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd certainly like a great review from you on your favorite podcasting platform. But more than that, what really makes a difference to a show like ours is a recommendation to someone who would love this show like you do. Word of mouth referrals to your network and your podcast devouring friends is incredibly helpful to the growth of this show. For episode links and info, go to concentricshow.com. Thank you so much, and remember to keep building alignment to build a better life.